Hello, this is Kevin Bowersox, creator of the blog 2Thought. In today's tutorial, we will explore using an element collection to map a simple collection of elements within an entity. This will continue along our JPA theme, which has been the theme of previous posts. If you would like to follow along with today's tutorial, you can download the source code from the JPA Embedding Embeddables within Entities post, because this is the source code that we will begin from during our tutorial. To download the code, just visit my blog and find the post and click on the GitHub icon, and you can download the source to follow along with this tutorial. So let's begin. Prior to doing any JPA configuration, we should explore some DDL that I have set up that will assist us throughout this tutorial. Within my database, I have created a post mention table. And what I envision this table as is, let's say we have a crawler that goes out and finds all the websites that mention a post we have made from our blog. This data is then fed into this table that simply has the post ID and the URL. What our goal will be is to get these URLs into a simple list of strings within an entity without actually creating an entity for the post mention table. This could be useful in a situation where you inherit a database and you don't actually control the DDL. It's also useful if you're not interested in other attributes. Imagine we had several other columns in this table and we really weren't concerned with them. If we wanted to keep things rather concise, we could rely on an element collection so we don't have to pull in those other attributes and create an entity and manage that entity. One thing we need to be aware of, though, is that the lifespan of the element collection is directly tied to the entity in which it is composed. So if we would delete an entity that contained an element collection, we would lose this table and its information. The DDL that I have created to support this post will be within the project you download. If you download the final source code, you'll notice there's this scripts file, or this tutorial file within the scripts directory in the root of the project. You can use this to set up the DDL to follow along. So now we'll begin annotating our entity to use an element collection. The first thing we'll do is open up our post entity, and within that entity we will add a new field, and it will be a list of strings. I'm going to call that list URLs, and we'll instantiate it as an array list of strings. And then we will add a getter and setter for the list. And at this point we can begin our annotations. So the first one we'll add is ElementCollection, and the second is collection table. The element collection annotation is not required. I've just added it to be thorough. Within the collection table annotation, we need to specify the name element, which corresponds with the table. So that was post mention. And then we also need to define a join column. And the join column will be the post ID field within our table. So our JPA configuration has been completed, except for one thing. We need to specify the column name, since it is different from what we are using in the actual database. Here I'm using URLs, whereas the column we would like to pull is named URL. So let's just review this quickly. On the list, we annotate with ElementCollection, which is optional. We also annotate with collection table, and we specify the name of the table that contains the information we'd like to pull, and then we specify the join column, which will be used to create the relationship between this entity's primary key and the key within our other table that we'll use to correspond a post with the URLs that belong to it. So I'm going to save this. As usual, we will use our unit tests to make sure everything is completed correctly. So I'm going to create a new test. And within that test, I'm actually going to pull an existing, or use an existing post. So I'm just going to look for one. Here you can see, well, I have 33. Here's the post ID. We'll use that one. So we'll pull post 33 from the database, and let's assert that it has at least some URLs. And then we'll also add a new URL. And we will save that to the database. And then we'll pull that back out of the database. And now let's actually do this. I wouldn't advise this in a test that you're actually using for a system, but just for our purposes, I'm going to just check that after we add the post, that the size has been increased by 1, which would indicate that after we add the URL, I'm going to check that the list of URLs has an additional item by just looking at size plus 1. Okay, so we have our test set up. Let's give it a go. Oops. And it helps if you save the test before you run it. And we had an error. It's telling me that that is already in the database. Yep, and there we can see it. So let me delete it out, and then we'll run our test again. Okay, and this time it completes because we removed that duplicate entry within the table. Let's head over to the database to make sure that it did get persisted. So we see we have dzone in Google, and we should have tothought. Yep. Alright, so it looks like everything was successful. So just to review, an element collection allowed us to take the post mention table and retrieve one of its attributes, or one of its columns, URL, into a list of strings within the post entity. This differs from creating a regular one-to-many relationship because we didn't actually create an entity for the post mention table. I'm glad you joined me for this tutorial, and I hope you'll join me for the next one. Until we meet again, this is Kevin Bowersox from the Tothought blog.